Good afternoon, everyone. My name's June Lancaster. Welcome. I'm the MD of Asset Wisdom, and we are an education provider, and we're mainly in asset management and in BIM as we're moving forward. Really good to have you here. I will introduce my colleague, Andy Watts, who is an asset manager. He's also been a consultant in asset management, and he was MD of the Institute of Asset Management. So he's seen asset management from all people's objectives, and I think understands learning because he'll have spent lots of time talking to people that were members of the Asset Management Institute of Asset Management about their learning needs. So Andy, over to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, so I've had many years in asset management, but I guess when it started, asset management wasn't really talked about back in my career anyway. It started in the late or mid 80s. But I, interestingly, just spent half that time, nearly 17, 18 years in industry and the other half consulting. So seen two perspectives of helping people, helping organizations transform the way they do asset management. And a big part of that is the people. And that's really what we're talking about today. It's about learning in our profession and how that can support how you deliver your role and the organizational objectives that you're a part of. Okay, so hopefully the title of this webinar, and thanks to the CIOB for inviting us to share this with you, has caught your attention about a learning journey. Because life is a learning journey, as people say, and certainly one through asset management is very much the same. There's a few things we're going to cover off today, and we'll just look at the agenda briefly. So learning journeys, what are they? Why are they important, both for your own career in your profession and also for your organization? We'll then move on to asset management itself. In the time we've got, it's 3 or 4 graphics, pictures, slides on some basic principles around good asset management. And we'll talk about how that impacts, particularly the sort of building and construction sector, being your profession today. We'll then have a look at information. There's a link in the middle around that. Sort of one of the foundations to good asset management is very much the information that we use. And you may have heard of a term, an acronym BIM, BIM, or Business Information Modeling. We'll touch on that towards the end because it's very much an important part of any construction refurbishment activity, that the right information is captured for a whole host of reasons. So it is important for what we'll be talking about today. And then we'll have a look at how you can get involved in your own learning journey, whether you're on one and you want to enhance that further, or start the process of thinking, okay, the profession of asset management is certainly something I'm interested in for the work I do, and how you can start on that learning journey. The chat's open. As I say, if you were, some of you may have heard June and I chatting just before we formally started. Quite often use Teams or go to webinar for these events. We're using Zoom for this one, and a little bit new to me, but there is obviously chat functions there. You should be able to access that from your main screen. Feel free to pop comments in. There is a little poll that we'll do, so you'll be asked to use that if that's something you've got easy access to. Okay, so we'll jump straight in. I think the important takeaway is that asset management will help you achieve safety, service, and compliance, and that's a bit of a theme that we run through as the session goes on. So we said we'd talk about learning journeys and what does it mean to you? So the question here is, what does it really take to learn? What does that mean? And we're going to build a little graphic that certainly gives my point of view, something that I've shared with a lot of organizations, and they get this, so hopefully we'll get that across today as well. I think the purpose of this, looking in the bottom left, being able to assess the value of investments. So learning doesn't always come free. It is something that an organization invests in. And that's an important part of any plan that an organization has, and it has 3 key components. So the first of these is knowledge. And that's very much around the facts, the information, a level of awareness and understanding of the profession, of the task, of the activities that you're undertaking. And that's theoretical in some ways. It's that sort of base and core that you can draw upon to understand how to do something practically. And that leads us into the next one, which is the skill. And that's that physical ability to undertake what it is you're required to do. So you can apply that knowledge through a practical skill of knowing how to do something. And if we looked at this in the driving world, and when I took my driving test, it was just a practical test. There was no theory, but nowadays you have your theory test, which is the knowledge, and you have your driving test, which is the skill and the practice. And really, to become a good driver, to have embedded that learning, you then need to put both those into practice and gain some experience. So when we're talking about, what does it really take to learn? It takes all those three things coming together. And what we're showing in this little model here is this learning box, where we keep the secret of good learning, is really about as you grow your learning, as you grow the size of that box, you're gaining knowledge, you're increasing knowledge, you're increasing your skill, you're increasing your experience. And that's when learning really gets embedded and takes a hold. So that's what we mean when we're talking about education, which is what we do, and learning. But there are some other important aspects of making this really work. First of all, it's all about you and about what you do. So learning isn't done to you or done for you. It's about what you do or decide to do, and sort of ensure that it's yourself that's doing that. It's something that you gain through activities that you do. It's about gaining two things, one of which is what I call the sort of core generic knowledge for a profession. So if we're talking about asset management today, you can gain knowledge about asset management, you can gain recognition or qualifications for that. The work that we do leads people towards the IAM, Institute of Asset Management, have a certificate qualification in it's a level 3 qualification in asset management. The learning we provide is all geared towards you achieving that. Or there's the foundational level, a little bit lower than that gains recognition again from the Institute for understanding the basics of asset management. So that's recognition of what you know in a generic sort of sense. But beyond that, you've then got specific or applied knowledge, which puts that knowledge and that learning into context of your profession. And that's when it really becomes valuable to you. And again, there are elements to the learning that we provide that take that step as well and say, how do we apply this? So it's relevant to some of you today will be in the housing sector, the construction sector for housing associations. And so you can enhance the learning, your generic learning with some very specific learning in the discipline that you work in. And that helps you, looking at the model again there, gain that knowledge, you can apply that skill and you can gain that experience. The wider benefits of learning, if we look at the organization itself, well, it's enhancing your value to society. Now that sounds a bit grand, but it is. We all work to deliver some sort of product or service for people, usually for somebody else, whether it's a business to business or business to the community. And so by increasing our own learning and our ability to deliver our roles in our professions, then we're adding value to society. We do that through adding value to our own organizations, and then obviously in the role that you're delivering. So there is a strong purpose, a strong driver to jump on your learning journey and start to take advantage of these benefits by taking it on board yourself and building your skill set. And being here today is a good part of that. You'll either increase your knowledge or embed your knowledge of asset management a little bit, on building information a little bit, and also understand more about the journey itself. So a quick poll, just to check you're all still listening in and you're still with me. A couple of questions for you, and we're going to use the chat just to pop an answer in. There's an A or a B for each question. So when you've had a look at both questions, if you just pop in the chat, if you think A for the first one and B for the second one, AB or AA or whatever. So the two questions really are you or your colleagues, so the day-to-day work that you do, is that focused on A or B? Is it focused more on, asset data, the location of assets, the current condition of assets, the current issues and targets that you're facing, and sort of monthly near-term stuff? Or is your focus more on, wider information for more strategic decisions, looking at performance trends over the long term, looking at whole life costs over the long term? So is your role very near term with regards to the assets that you're involved with, or more long term? And similar for your organization itself, and particularly the top management in your organization, the leadership in your organization, are they focused, is the pressure focused on short-term results and success, current issues and reputation, or the longer term again, delivering value for the organization, its customers, looking at the clarity of what you do as an organization and the future goals? So nice to see one or two things popping up. I think you can all see each other's chat, so I shall let that build a little bit, and we'll come that to that. So I like the 1 and 2 bit there as well, so we can make sure we get the questions answered, although I didn't number them in the poll. But looking at those, AB, BB, BB, just going to move my window. Excellent. Okay. Well, there's some good news. The rationale and the reason behind this poll and these 2 questions, there isn't a reference on the screen actually, but there is an international standards organizational document that's called Managing Assets in the Context of Asset Management. And it says, if you Google it, you'll find it. I think it's free to download. It's also on the Institute of Asset Management's website. And it's only a 3-4 page document, but it sets out a little table in the middle that says, are you managing assets near term, or are you in asset management long term? And these are some of the sort of questions it pulls out. So it's a good reference point just to sort of look at the difference between this near-term view of just managing the physical assets and the longer-term view of doing good asset management for the wider picture for the longer term. And I think looking at the responses there, thank you for all of you popping those in. It feels like you're in asset management, which is great. Some of the industries and organizations I work with feel they are, but they tend to have a more near-term focus. And so it's good to see that certainly where you're coming from, that longer-term feel is pulling through, which is nice to see. Okay, just moving on. So a little bit about asset management. Some of this will hopefully be fairly familiar. There might be some new graphics. So there's a graphic here which is taken from the Institute of Asset Management. Their documents, the anatomy is a very useful reference. If you can come across that, we can send out some links to these documents after the webinar for everybody that's attended. But the landscape for asset management was developed not just in the UK but globally. By an organization called the Global Forum for Maintenance and Asset Management, which is a collection of all the international bodies for asset management who come together. And this landscape really describes the overarching view of what asset management involves and contains. And it was actually updated. If you've seen a version of this before, it may have had just 6 boxes, and it was well known as the 6-box model, as well as an asset management landscape. It's now the 10-box model. Because what we've learned since, certainly I was involved in the early authoring of PAS 55, which was the forerunner to ISO 55000, which was part of the review panel for. When we were authoring those, we wanted to set out something that encapsulated, the breadth of asset management as opposed to that managing assets. And the extension from 6 boxes to 10 boxes was to actually draw out some of the high level context and stuff and separate it out. So, new to this is context and purpose of an organization has become so important, and I think it's seen now as one of the differentiators in good asset management organizations is that they really understand their purpose for being and how everything aligns to that. Leadership and governance is one of the keys to success. Values and outcome on the right hand side here is another one which again is a growing trend in people understanding and cascading through the organization, how you create value and focus on the outcomes that you deliver, not just a physical asset, but what's the asset's purpose? How does that deliver something for society at large? And, in the center of all this still and around it, we have the life cycle of the asset, and we have, the good things like policy, strategy, planning, decision-making, information again, and the fact that ISO 55000, the international standard for asset management, does say very clearly that you need to have a risk-based process for doing good asset management. So that's obviously central in here as well. So some of the things to think about: how do you define asset management? There are 3 definitions I want to share with you. And these come from 3 separate sources very early on. So PAS 55, let's say the forerunner to ISO, was developed in the 90s and then released and sort of took traction internationally and became the ISO. It defined asset management, as it says on the screen, quite a long definition: systematic and coordinated activities and practices through which an organization optimally and sustainably manages its assets and asset systems, their associated performance, risk and expenditure. We'll touch on that later, that balance between cost, risk and performance over the life cycle for achieving the purpose of the organization. Quite long-winded. Interestingly, in contrast to that, the ISO didn't define asset management, and there's a long story behind it. But when you bring lots of countries together that all wanted to develop an ISO from their individual forerunners to it, they couldn't quite agree on a definition. But it does state, so it has a view that asset management is the coordinated activities of an organization to realize the value from its assets. And it then goes on to say that an asset is an item, a thing, or an entity that has potential or actual value to the organization. So not quite as wordy, a little bit more succinct, but gets the same sort of essence across. And finally, the Global Forum for Asset Management, its definition is that it's the life cycle management of physical assets to achieve the stated outputs of the enterprise. So there's a common thread through that, which is, an organization owns assets to add value to itself and to society. Our role in the profession is to ensure that we look after those assets in a way that they deliver their purpose throughout the life cycle. And what we'll see today is that, a critical part of that is the very early acquire and create side of the assets, which is where very much the constructional side of it comes into. So looking at alignment within asset management, one of the key things about driving good asset management into an organization is this concept of alignment or line of sight. It's often referred to through an organization, so that everything you do is pointing towards that organizational purpose at the top. Everything you invest in, whether that's in learning, as we said earlier, or it's the physical side, is delivering this value to the organization's purpose. And the standard for asset management says that you will cascade that down. So it runs through a fairly typical and hopefully familiar set of cascades, from the purpose through a policy where you set out your guiding principles to doing asset management well, through your strategy, which is where you would define your approach to asset management, and the framework or operating model or management system, if you're going for ISO accreditation, would all be defined in your strategic approach to asset management. And you may define that down even further into asset classes or asset groups, or region by region, so you can get some clarity and context in there as well. And also the technical standards and design standards that you want the organization to operate to. And again, that's really important in sort of building and construction arena, and we'll have a look at that later. Once you've defined that policy and strategy or approach to asset management, you apply it. And when applying it, you create your asset management plans, which is the physical set of activities that you're going to deliver for either building new assets, operating, maintaining, renewing, refurbishing, or just delivering services from them. And all that is documented in asset management plans, which is then usually split up by programs and then by projects and then by schedules to be delivered physically out on site. The little feedback arrow is really important, because what you're looking at is, do all of those activities actually deliver your organizational purpose? And so you review and iterate this to ensure that the things that you planned for, the way that you deliver that, is delivering what you want. And if not, then again, good practice would say, okay, so you adjust back through that. Is your strategy wrong? You know, are the models you're using wrong? Are the design standards you're using not right for what you want to do? So the feedback loop around that circuit is very important. The way that there's a slight shift, probably over the last couple of decades, really, from a very typical policy strategy plan model to the ISO model, which is a strategic asset management plan, which pulls together asset management policy, strategy, the operating model, the framework, and all the things shown encompassed by the teal box in the graphic, and the asset management plans themselves. So if you do have an interest in achieving ISO for your organization, there are two key things that it says you will have, and that is, one is your strategic asset management plan, and the other is your asset management plans. And that's just the way they set things out. So the SAMP, as it's known, the strategic plan, it's a key document, sits at the heart of the organization's approach. It's a live, living approach. It's not, a document that should sit on a shelf, but it does give that guidance, that process, the management system for defining all the sort of activities that you undertake in asset management to deliver the asset life cycle, including, of course, design and build and refurbishments. If we look at construction for a minute and how that sort of fits into this, then clearly that's very much at the beginning of the life cycle phase, or at the end of the life cycle. We'll see in a few moments' time when we look at some whole life costs, that you build assets, you operate them for a while, and then they tend to be refurbished or repurposed. So, construction activity, absolutely key thing here, and I hope it's something that's embedded within your thought processes already, but it must align with the purpose. So you're building things that align with the purpose, and that's developed to a robust standard and strategy. The technical and design standards that are embedded within the organization, must be followed. A little bit blunt on here, I've said stick to them. I hope you're not shocked by, but equally probably not too surprised by the fact that there are a lot of organizations I've certainly worked with that don't always follow the design standards. There's perhaps a contextual reason out on site or something else, but it does leave them liable to failures or unforeseen events in the future. So the technical design standards that are embedded in that top half of the alignment diagram on the left, are there to be followed and there to be to define the way that things are delivered out on site. The impact of not doing that, of course, is it can last the lifetime of the asset. So if you change something up front that's been designed in a certain way, often things should be designed and built in a way that has the whole life cycle in mind. And it's all being costed out across that life cycle. Sadly, I've worked with clients where the design spec has either changed during build because of usually some other sort of external influence, and what they've found then is that the planned operating costs are much higher than expected, or the service isn't delivered to the standard they wanted because of changes that were made without thinking about the impact of that on the rest of the life cycle of the asset. So a little bit blunt, but really important that you stay with those designs or go back and get some governance around why something's changing and what that might mean for the rest of that asset's life cycle, be it in a cost to performance or a risk-based approach to compliance and other things. So that's an important takeaway. That little hierarchy, achieving alignment through that is where the ISO standard takes us. But the governance around ensuring that that is followed and embedded within the organizations that you work with is really, really important. And there's plenty of other good learning opportunities around different elements of that down in the detail. But at a super basic level, that's a nice model to keep in mind when talking about asset management. How does that fit into an organization? Just a quick look at this. This is one of many operating models that organizations might use or deploy. I've worked in large national infrastructures down to small organizations, and they all have something similar on different scales. And what this is really showing is that you get that transition, like we saw in the other hierarchy, from left to right in this case, of the corporate organizational purpose and priorities, and how that moves from a sort of business outward facing viewpoint through to asset facing down at the right hand side of this particular graphic, going through the things that we talked about a moment ago. So strategy and planning, program management, and then delivery out on site. And all that's supported across the bottom by a good management system, processes, organizational models, people with the right skills and capabilities, and that's where the learning element comes in. Is having great processes is step one. Having great people with the right learning to deliver those processes will deliver the value. And of course, the information and technology to support the process. The other reason for popping this up is that if we put the big yellow line, as people often refer to it, who I work with, because it always sits there, a lot of organizations outsource some of the end-to-end asset management activities. And where they outsource them is a really interesting question to the organization as to how they manage things beyond the yellow line. So very typically, where the yellow line sitting on here is that, you know, an organization might outsource major projects, either turnkey or other processes, or some of the maintenance or operational activities. And the important bit when delivering good asset management is to ensure that those outsourced activities are all following that same alignment or line of sight and approach that the organization has planned. So the contracting elements of what is outsourced, it's really important to get those contracts really tight about what you're asking to be delivered, so that you get back what you expect again for the rest of the asset's life cycle. And that yellow line can move depending which organization you're in. There are some that might say, well, okay, we'll do the high level stuff, we'll develop the high level plans and some programs and optimize those programs, but we'll outsource, you know, much larger pieces of work, not turnkey projects, but whole programs of activity. And again, the same principle applies. You know, ensure that you're managing those programs through your supply chain in a way that they are an extension, an integrated extension of your organization. And I've seen a lot of it. In fact, I'm working with an organization at the moment on some learning, and they're actually bringing their suppliers in to mix with their own people and share the same learning in asset management. So they get this completely joined up approach to how they operate as a combined organization. And I think that's really great. It's not only building that relationship, but it's ensuring that everybody understands the same common language around asset management, whether you're in the core business or the supply chain, which is quite diverse. So just things to keep in mind. Okay, we're back to our 3-box models. I'm an engineer by background, electrical engineer at that. So if anybody's heard of Fleming's left-hand rule, then give me a smiley face in the chat. But Fleming said, you know, there's sort of 3 main things to think about in his world of motive power, and it's a model I tend to use a lot. This one's looking at investment again, but now we're in the world of asset management, not learning, and just these points that we said we'd look at around cost, risk, and performance. So when developing solutions, and this is the core to good asset management, we need to look over the whole life of the asset. We need to think about every phase of that asset and what's its purpose going to be. So the more value you can create for your organization, you consider these 3 things. And the way this graphic works to get the value box as big as possible, you're looking to minimize the whole life cost. So you're looking at, you know, the optimum life cycle of the asset. You're balancing your TOTEX costing here. So TOTEX being CapEx and OpEx, your capital investment to create the asset, your OpEx, operating expenditure, to run that asset for its lifetime before you then refurbish or do something else. And also considering within that cost analysis, of course, the stakeholder constraints, any funding constraints and other things, but minimizing whole life cost to that optimum level is the right way to go as far as delivering value is concerned. Doesn't mean to say it'll be the lowest cost, because you are optimizing across the whole life cycle. Increasing risk mitigation, the more you can mitigate the risks to your organization, the greater the value you have. And there's an immediate balance there with cost. And of course, the greater benefits you can realize from any activities or investments, the more value it adds to your organization. And these three move around together all the time. You can always spend more money and get more benefit or mitigate more risk, but you're finding that optimum balance. And it's for your organization against its purpose to get its leadership to think, okay, what is our risk appetite? What are our funding constraints? What are the benefits we want to realize? What's the minimum legal compliance as opposed to the completely delighting the end user? So think about service, think about safety, think about compliance. And, particularly in, if we look at the sort of housing sector at the moment, compliance is becoming a massive issue. We'll just touch on that as we move into information. But safety has always been a driver on organizations, and service to customer, again, it goes without saying. So this is another little bit of learning. Again, it might be familiar with where you are at the moment, but really important to get that balance around value between cost, risk, and performance. Any changes to what was planned at the outset can change any of these. Cost cutting on the left-hand side will often increase risk or reduce the benefits, and vice versa across. So it's that little blunt message again, plan for the life cycle of the asset and deliver at the start to that and stick to it. Just touching on whole life cost, again, there's a nice play into the whole sort of building and construction arena here, because as you can see from this sort of simplistic chart, this is showing a timeline through the life cycle, cost on the left-hand side, and what we're showing here is some costs to planning activities. Hopefully a reasonable amount of planning goes in up front, and then you get to that pivotal point of let's create the assets. So you get a large capital spend, fairly typically, and following that you pick up the operating cost, which is often a little peak to start with, sometimes through early failure, sometimes through just finishing handovers and other activities, and then a sort of steady operating cost for the assets, which at some point it starts then to increase, and that'll be your sort of trigger point for saying, okay, what do we do at that point in the asset life cycle? Quite often what happens is you get a redefining. If the service is still required, you're then looking at another little planning phase, which is the single teal line, and then a block of refurbishment or repurposing of the asset before you start another operating phase. And sometimes the operating phase costs in the second phase are slightly higher. It maybe you need to do enhanced maintenance or more frequent attention to the asset, and you can repeat that cycle effectively as many times as you need to, where it's economically viable to do so. A few things to watch out for. Developing whole life cost locks in value at the start. When you produce a spec for a new asset or a refurbishment of asset, again, you're locking in the value. So stick to that specification and deliver on it, because that protects the value you're going to deliver long term, and also protects and assures the compliance. One of the real lookouts is that if you don't deliver to spec, then you may fall foul of compliance, which isn't wanted. Finally, construction plays a huge part in ensuring all this is delivered. So, the weight is on the shoulders of those people often creating new assets. As I look out of the window of the offices I'm in today, there's a massive construction site I've been watching for years, and for months. I'm thinking, oh, they're building all this to spec. They're busy putting piles in the ground today. So hopefully they're the right depth and strength that's needed. But that early phase of delivering that first creation of assets is so important. And apart from that, it generates most of that core asset information, the as-built, that's needed for years and years and years of operation. And that's a really important part of good asset management, is that collection, that management of that information. So much of it in a number of organizations I work with where they don't have good drawings, good base information, all the information that effectively is there from the start and lost on the way. And this is where we will move into looking at sort of building information modeling. That even the government was looking at this and saying, yeah, we've got to do more. We've got to introduce something that helps organizations capture all this early data and use it through its life cycle. With the greatest respect, I want to actually draw on something that the CIOB led on, which was the Hackett report after Grenfell, and you know, horrible tragedy. And sadly, we do learn the hard way sometimes. Piper Alpha, many years ago, was an oil rig disaster that sort of started people focusing on asset management, as did some of the rail incidents. This is very recent, very relevant. It's around buildings. And the important bit I just want to draw from this is the piece about the golden thread, because it's been embedded in asset management for so long. And what this report was saying very plainly, Judith was saying that, you know, the bit I've highlighted, the golden thread is intended to ensure that the right information gets to the right people at the right time. And that's phraseology that has been used for years in asset management, in the big infrastructures. I tend to work in water, electricity, gas, rail, road fairly frequently, and, you know, working now with national highways, and that same phraseology is used in their organization. You know, we need to enable people to do things well. If we want them to build new bridges that are compliant, we provide the information to them, they build them to spec, we record all the information for future audit purposes. And it is so important. And, you know, it's led to, I think, two things really. One, increased legislation around these areas, but also, you know, Michael Gove looking for the construction industry, the buildings industry, to start to professionalize even further what they do, to the point of saying, you know, great for us, a learning organization, that people should start to get recognition and start to go on learning journeys themselves. So I bring this up with respect, but it just drives home this need of good information at the start of and throughout the asset life cycle is such an important piece of good asset management. So if we look at just a little bit about building information modeling, it may be new to you. It's often referred to as BIM, and people call the M sometimes call it building information management, building information models. I think the government originally launched it as modeling. But it's a process that has gone through a number of iterations. The graphic really is saying, hey, look, there's information around the whole life cycle of a building that needs to be captured and kept alive right from the outset. And that's what these building information models are. There are many systems out there to do this now, but the real value is that it's a process, it's an approach to ensuring that information is right, rather than it being, and often seen as, just a system for capturing information. So it does go much further than just being the system. But a part of the process of business information modeling, then you do need to, and this is in, there's a couple of ISO references at the end, you do need to capture every aspect of built assets as they're being developed, and put that in some sort of system, and also a description that includes these information-rich 3D models. You know, many moons ago, my father, in fact, was an architect, and as a young child, I used to go and sort of see him at a weekend if he was working and help print off huge blueprint drawings, which, you know, were on the old machines. Now, of course, it's all CAD, it's all electronic, it's digital. There are so many technologies for creating from existing assets these 3D models. And, you know, in some of the other asset-intensive industries I work in, they're using visualization through 3D models as a way of teaching and learning to help people understand the asset without actually going out to site. But it's an important thing to know. There's a huge link with asset management from our friends and colleagues in the BIM world. And it's growing in interest. And I think, you know, the Hackett report plays to this, that says, look, create this information, capture it, keep it alive throughout the whole life cycle of the asset. And that's really important. They're the references. We've talked about ISO 55000 for asset management. There's a couple of other references there if you want to know more about BIM in itself. And it, you know, again, from demand, it's something that we offer as a particular module on the advanced learning we do on BIM itself and its relationship and dependency in and around asset management. Finally, we said we'd have a look at building your own learning journey. It's a fairly complex slide here, but it's telling a few different stories. I think the important bit is it all starts with something fairly basic and foundation, This isn't a big sales pitch, but there's a little plug in there. For as little as £175, you can start your journey with this foundation in asset management. And that's just a way of embedding the common language, your sort of wider understanding of the principles of asset management. But it does give you that starting point. In every journey, you can look forward to your destination, but understanding where you start from is equally important. And beyond that, there are different routes that your journey might take you. Across the top, we've got a fairly complex journey for practitioners, people heavily involved in delivering asset management on a day-to-day basis. And there's a series of modules and learning that you can go through that covers off the whole scope. And this leads towards that qualification, the recognition that we talked about from the Institute of Asset Management. They have their certificate level qualification, the syllabus of which is represented by all the red modules on the learning journey here. This particular graphic I picked up takes that into that advanced learning as well, and the contextual learning, and it shows that what you can do as a part of your journey is then make it very specific to your own activity, your own profession. And this one shows typical housing approach to that, which we work with a lot of housing associations, local government authorities, and they can learn the good basics of asset management through the foundation. They can extend that to the sort of practitioner level through the certificate, and then choose the housing route to say, okay, how do we apply this learning at different stages into our sector to really make it real for what we do. And that's been seen as sort of a real value add. Many years ago, there was a lot of good generic asset management training as there is out there now, but making it specific, making it in context of my job, my role, makes a lot of difference. So there's a particular example of a few journeys for either those that want to know more or know more in context. If you already feel fairly confident in some of those areas, there are other sort of specialist things that you can dip into. A lot of organizations that feel they're fairly good, fairly competent in delivering asset management, might have policies and strategies, but not yet pull these into a strategic asset management plan, which is one of the requirements of achieving ISO certification. So there's a series of learnings, again, you can go through that looks at, well, okay, how do you develop this strategic plan? How do you keep it alive and keep it maintained and embedded within your organization? So you can go down that route of saying, I want to learn a little bit more and become good at helping my organization deliver this sort of development and achievements. It may be you're in the information world and there's a couple of different routes. You could get some specialist training around building information modeling, what that means, and the depths that you need to go to ensure that you capture all the right information through structured processes and use that to inform the rest of that asset journey. Or more generic information management, over the whole life cycle of information itself. So again, several different routes that you can take to build your asset management learning journey. And a big part of what we do is help people understand what sort of journey they need to go on, or would like to go on, how that will add value to their organization, and the sort of options that are available to them. So there's a lot of good learning that you can take up, either through the institute, face-to-face, online, and online learning is certainly being seen, I think, as a very flexible way to learn these days. It's a big part of what we offer, as well as some face-to-face. And it all, just looking at the bottom of the graphic here, I want to push this message home that all this is building your ability to achieve that safety, service, and compliance through the work and the role that you do. So that's been a fairly quick sort of whistle-stop tour of a little bit about asset management, a little about learning journeys, a little about information, and that's what we wanted to put across today. Okay, well, look, thank you again. I trust that's been of use and you found it useful. Please come and chat to us. And take something away from this, think about those core principles and think about what you're going to do next to improve your knowledge, skills and experience. And let's keep this profession of asset management alive and well throughout all sectors.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That was really good. Andy, and as Andy said, just reinforce the messages. If you need anything, you've got our, you know, you've got information about how to contact us. And we will send out the pack and a few other things that may be of interest.